Hello, Sunday school teachers, preachers, and students. Welcome to SundaySchoolPreacher.com. I'm not coming with you, but I'll be with you when you get there. That's the sentiment I believe Moses feels when he tells the Israelites he won't make it to the promised land. Obedient faith is his hope for the Israelites as he reminds them of the Ten Commandments. He reminds them of the Decalogue and the faithfulness of God. They've wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. The old generation has died out and the new generation is poised to invade the land of Canaan. In this text, Moses writes about the same events studied last week, but from a different perspective. This text is 40 years later, with the Israelites poised east of the Jordan River. Moses knows he won't make it into the promised land. Soon, Moses also would be dead. At this point in Moses' life, he shares with the Israelites his most valuable possession. He reiterates the statutes and ordinances God had given him. Moses gives them the culmination of his life's work, the very best he has. He gives them the Word of God. As he looks back on his life, he stresses once again how important it is for the Israelites to obey the commands of God. He reminds them of the 24,000 Israelites who died because of unfaithfulness, and they know for themselves that their parents and forebears all died in the wilderness. Moses wants them to live and occupy the land. He knows that faithfulness and obedience is the key. As we continue in the theme of responding to God's faithfulness, this week I focus on faithful Moses, preparing the Israelites for obedient faith. Some of the ideas surrounding this week's text include the terms Decalogue, covenant, and faithfulness. Now, if you have Wi-Fi in your church Sunday school classroom or wherever you share this lesson, this channel is a good way to teach and discuss this week's lesson. What I provide is a concise overview of background, context, characters, themes, and topics that gets to the point, saves you time, and enhances your own teaching and study. If that's what you're looking for, you're in the right place. But the only way I know this is helpful is if you subscribe, click the like button, or say so in the comments. So please subscribe, like, comment, and then click the notifications bell so you'll be notified as soon as I upload next week's lesson. So with that said, welcome again to SundaySchoolPreacher.com, and let's go to work. First, we'll look at the background for today's text. The text comes from Deuteronomy, and Deuteronomy is the 5th book of the Pentateuch. Moses is credited as its author, although its ending chapter writes about the death of Moses. And since Moses couldn't have written about his own death, scholars believe his lieutenant, Joshua, penned the final chapter. The Israelites have wandered in the desert for 40 years, and they are now awaiting the invasion of the promised land of Canaan. The New Interpreter Study Bible explains that the name Deuteronomy is the Greek translation of the Hebrew words used in Deuteronomy 17, the 17th chapter, 18th verse. For these words are a second law, or a copy of the law. And those were given to Israel at Mount Sinai, and it's called Mount Horeb in this text in Deuteronomy. So the first law to which Deuteronomy will refer is the Ten Commandments. And we also know these 10 commandments as the Decalogue. Nelson's Bible Handbook notes that the New Testament quotes Deuteronomy more than 80 times. Jesus often quoted Deuteronomy, and when asked to name the most important law, Jesus responded with, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind." And that comes from Deuteronomy, the 6th chapter, verse 5. The NISB also notes that the central themes of Deuteronomy focus on the nature and unique status of Israel as a nation. One nation, living under one law, and settled on one land are its major goals. Undergirding the one nation, one law, and one land theme is the realization that there is only one God who's chosen Israel to be a special people, with which God makes a special covenant. Chapters 1 and 2 tell us that 40 years have passed since Moses led Israel as an enslaved group of Hebrews out of Egypt, and recount the story of Israel's refusal to enter the Promised Land. Chapters 1 and 2 recount the penalty for Israel's rebellion, which is the desert years, and Moses' view of Canaan from Mount Pisgah after God gives Moses a blistering rebuke, declaring that he would never enter the Promised Land. Among the events Deuteronomy records is this reiteration of the account of the Israelites just before they invade the Promised Land. Deuteronomy retells this story from a perspective that's 40 years later. They've traveled through the wilderness all this time. And in our text today, Moses recounts the instructions God has given them. And he reminds them of the importance of keeping the commandments. They should readily understand that importance, given that all of their parents and forebears died in the desert because of unfaithfulness and disobedience. At this point, Moses reminds them again, so that as they take the land, they'll not become complacent and forget where the one true God has brought them from. Moses knows that he'll not enter the Promised Land. He also knows that they will face temptation from other gods once they enter the Promised Land. So Moses warns them not to make the mistakes of the past, but to go forward and be better than they have been in the past. Some important words to consider from this text include Decalogue, covenant, and faithfulness. So let's review last week and see how it connects to this week. Last week's lesson opened at Numbers, the 14th chapter, verse 10, saying, "Then the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting to all the Israelites." I noted how the glory of God is defined as the divine essence of God as absolutely resplendent and ultimately great. In other words, God is manifested at the tabernacle or the tent of meeting in a way that all the Israelites recognize as God. In verse 11, the Lord spoke to Moses. The Lord questioned, "How long will this people despise me, and how long will they refuse to believe in me in spite of all the signs that I've done among them?" God was angry with the Israelites. They demonstrated that they despised God and refused to believe in God, despite God delivering them from the Egyptians, despite God allowing them to cross the Red Sea, despite God giving them water to drink and bread and meat to eat. Despite all of this, the Israelites were faithless, and God had had enough. Verse 12 showed just how angry God was. God said, I'll strike them with pestilence and disinherit them, and I'll make of you, he's talking to Moses, he says, I'll make of you a nation greater and mightier than they. I noted that to disinherit is to completely walk away from. It brings to mind the idea that you don't even want to see them anymore. God was ready to disinherit the people whom he promised Abraham would become a great nation and would number as many as the sand of the sea. I also noted that at this point you get the idea that God wants nothing more to do with this unfaithful, rebellious, stiff-necked people. God was fed up with the Israelites. In the same way God promised Abraham to make him a great nation, now God tells Moses that God will make a great nation out of him. In verse 13, Moses skillfully began his advocacy for the Israelites. Moses, like a skillful lawyer defending a client, pleads his case with God. He begins by telling God, the Egyptians will hear of it. God had taken great care to deliver the descendants of Abraham from the Egyptians. In verse 14, Moses continued defending the Israelites, telling God, the Egyptians will tell the people of Canaan that their God was in the midst of them, seen face to face by them, and was with them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Moses was making the point to God that God had been present. God was there in their deliverance, and that if they are abandoned or destroyed now, it'll be seen as if God could not keep them. The point Moses was making was that these were God's people. And if the rest of the world sees them as defeated and wiped out, it was going to reflect on God. In verses 15 and 16, Moses pressed his point to God. He told God, if you kill this people all at once, the nations who have heard about you will say it's because the Lord was not able to bring this people into the land he swore to give to them. I noted that Moses was playing hardball with God. He pulled no punches. Moses was going to defend these Israelites with everything at his disposal. You need to get a Moses on your side. Moses went to bat for these unfaithful, rebellious, stiff-necked people with all of their faults and all of their failures. In verses 17 and 18, Moses went as far as to remind God of what God said to him in the past. Moses quotes back to God what God said in Exodus 34, 1 through 9. Moses reminds God that God should be slow to anger and abounding in love. He reminds God that God does not clear the guilty, but visits upon them the iniquity of the parents upon the children for the third and fourth generations. In verses 19 and 20, Moses asked God to forgive the iniquity of the Israelites because of the greatness of God's love. After hearing this passionate plea from Moses, God relented. God changed God's mind and said, I do forgive, just as you have asked. It was the passionate plea of Moses that changed God's mind. where God was ready to completely wipe out this nation, God was now ready to forgive, only because Moses pleaded on their behalf. I noted that it would be great if we all had a Moses to plead on our behalf. But the good news is that we do. Jesus is seated at the right hand of God, making intercession for us, even right now. Standard, Townsend, and Boyd's commentaries titled this week's lesson, Obedient Faith. The scripture text comes from Deuteronomy, the 4th chapter, verses 1 through 8, and verses 12 and 13. I'll read this text for you now from the New Revised Standard Version. We begin with a section entitled, Moses Commands Obedience. So now, Israel, give heed to the statutes and ordinances that I am teaching you to observe, so that you may live to enter and occupy the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, is giving you. You must neither add anything to what I command you, nor take anything away from it, but keep the commandments of the Lord your God with which I am charging you. You've seen for yourselves what the Lord did with regard to the Baal of Peor, how the Lord your God destroyed from among you everyone who followed the Baal of Peor, while those of you who held fast to the Lord your God are all alive today. See, just as the Lord my God has charged me, I now teach you statutes and ordinances for you to observe in the land that you are about to enter and occupy. You must observe them diligently, for this will show your wisdom and discernment to the peoples who, when they hear all these statutes, will say, surely this great nation is a wise and discerning people. For what other great nation has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is whenever we call to him? And what other great nation has statutes and ordinances as just as this entire law that I'm setting before you today? He declared to you his covenant, which he charged you to observe, that is, the 10 Commandments. And he wrote them on 2 stone tablets. And the Lord charged me at that time to teach you statutes and ordinances for you to observe in the land that you are about to cross into and occupy. So what takes place in this passage? This week's lesson covers the same events of last week, but from a different perspective. It was now 40 years later. The focus is to understand that God expected Israel's obedience. Moses knows that he won't enter the promised land. There will be new leadership. And he's now driving home the importance of obeying God. The old generation has died out. The new generation is about to see the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham. In verse 1, Moses opens with an admonition to heed the statutes and ordinances that he was teaching. He says, so that you may live to enter and occupy the land that the Lord, the God, your ancestors, is giving you. Moses knows, and all of Israel should know, that the old generation died in the wilderness because they were not faithful and obedient to God. Moses reminds them so that you may live. In verse 2, Moses warns the Israelites not to add anything to what I command you, nor take anything away from it. This same idea is echoed in Revelations 22:18 and 19. The NISB notes that the comprehensive nature of God's law did not rule out additions to its written text. And you can check Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 5, where Moses expounds on earlier laws. The written law could receive clarification and revision, but its fundamental truth as God's covenant law would remain unchanged. In verse 3, Moses reminds them of what God did to those who followed the Baal of Peor. Baal is another name for a god. The Baal of Peor mentioned here involved sexual relations with the women of Moab. Check Numbers 25 verses 1 through 5. And these, with the women of Moab, were encouraged by the worship. This sexual relations with the women of Moab was encouraged by the worship of the god of Baal at the local sanctuary. False worship led to betrayal of family ties, and the actions are seen as bringing about the evil consequences and plague that followed. Quote from the NISB. Townsend commentary notes that 24,000 Israelites died because of unfaithfulness. In verse 4, Moses makes the stark contrast between faithfulness and unfaithfulness. Moses tells them, "Those of you who held fast to the Lord your God are alive today." And this is a reminder that unfaithfulness leads to death. Their parents and forebears have died because of unfaithfulness. In verse 5, Moses tells the Israelites he's following instruction from God. He's teaching them to observe statutes and ordinances to observe in the land. Moses knows they'll face temptation to stray away from God, just as their parents and forebears did in the wilderness. In verse 6, he presses the point to follow them diligently. Then he adds that following these statutes and ordinances diligently will show your wisdom and discernment to the people who, when they hear them, will say, "Surely this is a great nation of wise and discerning people." Moses expects the neighboring nations to admire the Israelites. However, the Israelites will show soon enough that Moses' faith in the people was often misplaced. Verses 7 and 8 show how much hope and trust Moses placed in the Israelites. Moses imagines other nations saying, "What other great nation has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is whenever we call to him?" Moses knows he won't enter the promised land. He knows things will soon be out of his control. These laws, these statutes and ordinances that God had given him are his greatest possession. These are the statutes and ordinances that he's worked on across the years. These statutes and ordinances, these laws, are his most valuable possession, and they are the very best he has to offer to a people who soon stray from the very God who Moses had so diligently served. In verses 12 and 13, Moses reminds the Israelites of the power, majesty, and grandeur of the God of their covenant. He reminds them how God spoke to them out of the fire. And he reminds them that it wasn't just him coming up with these laws on his own. These laws came from God. They weren't just laws to follow, but more so, they were the covenant between them and God. In these 10 commandments, they would understand their duties and responsibilities toward God and their fellow human beings. It's a quote from the NISB. These 10 commandments may have been written 3,400 years ago, but they're still relevant today. In these commandments, these 10 commandments, we begin to understand how to relate to God and how to relate to each other. So let's give the text some context. There will be consequences and repercussions. That's what happened to the Israelites because of their unfaithfulness and rebellion. Consequences are the effect, result, or outcome of something occurring earlier. In this case, what occurred earlier was the rebellion of the Israelites in the wilderness. The consequence was a severe penalty. The old generation died in the wilderness and would never see the promised land. There are consequences and repercussions in our lives as well. You reap what you sow. If you're sowing love, grace, and righteousness, you'll reap the same. And those are the consequences and repercussions that I want in my life. Key characters in this text, of course, aside from God, Moses is the key character, and Moses is the first great leader of the Hebrew people, regarded by some as the author of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Moses is revered by Jews, Christians, and Muslims for his daring leadership and diplomacy, as well as his promulgation of the divine law. Key words, not necessarily in the text, but good for discussion. One key word would be Decalogue, and the Decalogue is the 10 Commandments found in Exodus, the 20th chapter, verses 1 through 17, which express the will and law of God and deal with relations between humans and God, as well as of humans with each other. That's the Decalogue. Covenant is another key word. A covenant is a formal agreement or treaty between two parties that establish a relationship and in which obligations and mutual responsibilities may be enacted. Many biblical covenants are found, some providing only divine promises, while others entail obligations. Faithfulness is another key word to think about in this text. Faithfulness is the characteristic of being steadfastly loyal to a person or to promises. Theologically, faithfulness is a basic description of God, who is perfectly faithful to all that God promises, in contrast to sinful humans who are unfaithful in their relationships and actions. Themes, topics, discussion, or sermon preparation ideas. One might be faithful until the end, and we would think of Moses in this way, being faithful until the end. A second might be, I'm not coming with you, but I'll see you when you get there. And of course, we would think about Moses as well. Questions. The Israelites worshipped Baal of Peor, and the resulting plague killed 24,000. Why did the Israelites so easily fall into worshiping other gods? And then a second question might be, are there ways in which we worship other gods today? And a concluding thought. Moses is approaching the end of his life. I suppose the equivalent of his last will and testament would be the statutes and ordinances God had given him across the years. As he prepares the Israelites for new leadership, he passes on the very best he has, and I believe his most valuable possession. Some people might argue otherwise, but for many, our most valuable possession is a life lived well in obedience to God. And a preview of next week's lesson. Next week's lesson remains in the Old Testament, now moving to the book of 1 Kings. In this next week's lesson, I discuss how a widow in a terrible situation is about to prepare her last meal for her and her son, and as she said, to eat it and die. The man of God asked her to feed him first. She follows the instructions of Elijah, and God blesses her for her faithfulness. As we continue in the theme of responses to God's faithfulness, I shall next week how God moved in miraculous ways. Next week's lesson is titled, Blessed for Faithfulness. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I am Reverend Dexter Alexander, and you've been listening to SundaySchoolPreacher.com. The only way I know this is helpful is if you subscribe, click the like button, or say so in the comments. Please also click the notifications bell so you'll be notified as soon as I upload next week's lesson. And if you don't mind, please share this site with other Sunday school teachers, preachers, and students. Thank you, and may God bless you real good.